Yeah, I'm actually on time with this one, but you'll understand why it's taken so long once we get into the explanation. Up to now, Injustice 1 was unique for this series because it had two of everyone. Injustice 2 was unique because some fights weren't clear who the canon fighter was because of the duo chapters. MK11 is unique because it does both. Injustice 2 Mobile gave us preset fighters in those chapters, but for this, I have to figure it out myself because MK Mobile never had any of the story modes added. I'll save my working out for after the results, just like last time. But that's not even the part that's been making me dread having to make this. It's this. How many Liu Kangs are there? Past and present? Nope. Try again. Human Revenant Fire God? Nope. Past and present from the MK11 timeline, then past and present from the new timeline created when Shang Tsung's team goes back into MK11 for Aftermath. Many characters have 4 variants here, and that's not even counting the numerous Liu Kangs and Raidens from the montage of prior timelines. Nor is that taking into account that Fire God Liu Kang is technically both Liu Kangs of the initial timeline merged, so who gets his wins? For the sake of my sanity, I'm going to count both timelines as one, consider Fire God Liu Kang exclusively past Liu Kang because in terms of characterization, he's a continuation of that version, and the Revenant version should be wiped by his past self's explicit changing of his destiny. And I'm going to ignore the past timelines as well. I won't be so kind to myself in the appendices videos I'm making after we catch up, but for now, I guess we should finally get started. Present Liu Kang defeats Jackie Briggs in a cutscene, loses to Cassie Cage, loses to past Liu Kang, and loses to past Raiden. That's 1 to 3. Past Liu Kang defeats present Liu Kang, loses to past Raiden, defeats present Jade in a cutscene, defeats present Kung Lao in a cutscene, defeats present Kitana, defeats present Kung Lao in gameplay, defeats Cetrion, defeats Kronika, loses to Shao Kahn, and both defeats and loses to Shang Tsung. See how complicated this is even if we don't split versions? That's 8 to 3. Together, the Liu Kangs achieved 9 to 6. Present Kung Lao loses to past Kung Lao, loses to past Liu Kang in a cutscene, loses to past Liu Kang in gameplay, and loses to Shang Tsung in a cutscene. That's 0 to 4. Past Kung Lao defeats Scorpion, defeats present Jade, defeats Scorpion in a cutscene, defeats present Kung Lao, defeats Geras, and loses to Shao Kahn. That's 5 to 1. Together, the Kung Laos achieve 5 to 5. Present Raiden has no fights. Past Raiden loses to Scorpion, defeats past Liu Kang, defeats present Jax, defeats Geras, defeats Frost, defeats present Liu Kang, loses to Fujin, defeats Kronika alongside Shang Tsung and Fujin in a cutscene, loses to Shang Tsung in a cutscene, and loses to Shang Tsung alongside Fujin. That's 6 to 4. Together, the Raidens achieve 6 to 4. Fujin loses to Geras alongside Shang Tsung in a cutscene, defeats past Cabal, defeats Noob Saibot, defeats present Jax, defeats Scorpion and Sub-Zero, defeats past Raiden, defeats Kronika alongside Raiden and Shang Tsung in a cutscene, and loses to Shang Tsung alongside Raiden. That's 7 to 2. Present Nightwolf defeats Shang Tsung and loses to past Nightwolf. That's 1 to 1. Past Nightwolf defeats Collector, defeats Frost, defeats Geras, defeats Twindell, defeats present Nightwolf, defeats Cetrion alongside Twindell, and loses to Shang Tsung. That's 6 to 1. Together, the Nightwolves achieve 7 to 2. Cetrion loses to Jackie Briggs, loses to past Liu Kang, and loses to Twindell and past Nightwolf. That's 0 to 3. Kronika loses to past Liu Kang, loses to Shang Tsung, Raiden, and Fujin together in a cutscene, and loses to Shang Tsung. That's 0 to 3. Bless you.
Thank you.
If they later reveal the bad ending also happened in the current multiverse, she'll get a single win. Geras loses to past Kung Lao, loses to past Sonya, loses to past Raiden, defeats Shang Tsung and Fujin in a cutscene, loses to past Nightwolf, and loses to Shao Kahn. That's 2 to 5. Cassie Cage defeats present Sonya, defeats present Cabal, defeats present Kitana, defeats present Liu Kang, and loses to Shao Kahn. That's 4 to 1. And this really highlights just how long a gap a character can have without fighting in these story modes, where after chapter 1, Cassie doesn't have another fight until the penultimate chapter of Aftermath. Present Johnny Cage defeats past Johnny, defeats past Aaron Black, defeats Sector, and defeats past Kano. That's 4 to 0. Past Johnny Cage loses to present Johnny, loses to present Kano off screen, and loses to Shao Kahn. That's 0 to 3. Together, the Johnnies achieve 4 to 3. Present Sonya Blade loses to Cassie. That's 0 to 1. Past Sonya Blade defeats past Cabal, defeats past Eren, defeats present Kano in a cutscene, defeats past Kano, and defeats Geras. That's 5 to 0. Together, the Sonyas achieve 5 to 1. Present Jax loses to past Jax, loses to past Raiden, loses to Shang Tsung in a cutscene, and loses to Fujin. That's 0 to 4. Past Jax defeats present Cabal, defeats present Jade, defeats Noob Saibot, and defeats present Jax. That's 4-0. I swear this isn't just Jackie slander, you'll see at the end. Together, the Jaxes achieve 4-4. Jackie Briggs defeats present Jade off-screen, loses to present Liu Kang in a cutscene, loses to present Jade in a cutscene, and defeats Cetrion. That's 2-2. Present Kano defeats past Johnny off-screen, and loses to past Sonya in a cutscene. That's 1-1. Past Kano loses to present Johnny, and loses to past Sonya. That's 0-2. Together, the Kanos achieve 1-3. Present Erron Black loses to Shiva. That's 0-1. Past Erron Black loses to Kotal, loses to present Johnny, and loses to past Sonya. That's 0-3. Together, the Errons achieve 0-4. Present Cabal loses to Cassie Cage, loses to past Jax, and loses to Fujin. That's 0-3. Past Cabal loses to past Sonya. That's 0-1. Together, the Cabals achieve 0-4. Hanzo Hasashi defeats Cyrax in a cutscene, defeats Sector, defeats Devora, and defeats Scorpion. That's 4-0. Scorpion loses to past Kung Lao, loses to past Kung Lao right after, loses to Hanzo, defeats Sub-Zero, defeats past Raiden, and loses to Fujin alongside Sub-Zero. That's 2-4. Together, the Scorpions achieve 6-4. Sub-Zero defeats Frost, defeats Cyrax, defeats Noob Saibot, loses to Scorpion, and loses to Fujin alongside Scorpion. That's 3-2. Noob Saibot loses to Sub-Zero, loses to past Jax, and loses to Fujin. That's 0-3. Frost loses to Sub-Zero, loses to past Raiden, and loses to past Nightwolf. That's 0-3. Cyrax loses to Hanzo in a cutscene, and loses to Sub-Zero. That's 0-2. Sector loses to Hanzo, and loses to present Johnny. That's 0-2. Present Kitana loses to Cassie Cage, loses to past Liu Kang in a cutscene, loses to past Liu Kang in gameplay, and loses to Shao Kahn in a cutscene. That's 0-4. Past Kitana defeats Scarlet, defeats Baraka, defeats Collector, defeats Shao Kahn, loses to Shiva, and loses to Twindell. That's 4-2. Together, the Katanas achieve 4-6. Present Jade loses to Jackie off-screen, loses to past Kung Lao, loses to past Jade, defeats Jackie in a cutscene, loses to past Jax, loses to past Liu Kang in a cutscene, loses to Shang Tsung in a cutscene, and loses to Twindell in a cutscene. That's 1-7. Past Jade loses to Shao Kahn in a cutscene, defeats present Jade, defeats Devora, defeats Collector, defeats Kotal, loses to Shiva, and loses to Twindell in a cutscene. That's 4-3. Together, the Jades achieve 5-10. Twindell loses to past Nightwolf, defeats Cetrion alongside past Nightwolf, defeats Shiva, defeats past Jade in a cutscene, defeats past Kitana, defeats present Jade in a cutscene, and loses to Shang Tsung alongside Shao Kahn. That's 5-2. Shao Kahn defeats Kotal Kahn in a cutscene, defeats past Jade in a cutscene, loses to Kotal, defeats Kotal in another cutscene, loses to past Kitana, defeats Geras, defeats Cassie Cage, defeats past Johnny Cage, defeats past Kung Lao, defeats Kotal in a cutscene again, defeats past Liu Kang, defeats present Kitana in a cutscene, and loses to Shang Tsung alongside Twindell. That's 10-3. Baraka loses to Kotal Kahn, loses to past Kitana, and loses to Shiva. That's 0-3. Scarlet loses to Kotal and loses to past Kitana. That's 0-2. Collector loses to past Jade, loses to past Kitana, and loses to past Nightwolf. That's 0-3. Devora defeats Kotal in a cutscene, loses to past Jade, and loses to Hanzo. That's 1-2. Kotal Kahn loses to Shao Kahn in a cutscene, defeats Baraka, defeats Scarlet, defeats past Erron, defeats Shao Kahn, loses to Devora in a cutscene, loses to past Jade, loses to Shao Kahn in a cutscene, loses to Shiva, and loses to Shao Kahn in a cutscene. That's 4-6. Shiva defeats Baraka, defeats present Erron, defeats past Jade, defeats Kotal, defeats past Kitana, and loses to Twindell. That's 5-1. Shang Tsung loses to Geras alongside Fujin in a cutscene, loses to present Nightwolf in a cutscene, defeats present Jade in a cutscene, defeats present Jax in a cutscene, defeats Kronika alongside Raiden and Fujin in a cutscene, defeats past Raiden in a cutscene, defeats past Nightwolf finally in gameplay, defeats Raiden and Fujin, defeats present Kung Lao in a cutscene, defeats Twindell and Shao Kahn, defeats Kronika, and both defeats and loses to past Liu Kang. That's 12-3. Now for my reasoning for the duo chapter results. Kung Lao has more dialogue exchanged with Jade and Scorpion, and while Liu Kang's exchange with Geras does set up the later reveal about Kronika's plans, it's Liu Kang holding the vials once the two paths reconvene, Lao handing it to him in Liu Kang's version, which feels kinda contrived. arrived. That aside, I applaud this fight for having something interesting for the characters to discuss in both versions. That's usually not the case. Sub-Zero just works better as the one to beat Frost and has a bit more interesting dialogue. He beats Cyrax because while Hanzo rejoins him before the cutscene of him freeing Cyrax, Sub-Zero doesn't do the same with Hanzo, instead popping into reality in the proper cutscene. While the cinematography for Hanzo vs Noob is a bit more interesting, Sub-Zero has the callback to MK9, while Hanzo doesn't say anything, unlike Sub-Zero. By contrast, both Sector encounters are good between the cinematography and the action and the dialogue. I give it to Hanzo just because the Sub-Zero one is a rehash of the comic, while Hanzo never got his shot at Sector after the MKX reveal. Anyone else ever wonder if these were meant to be Kung Lao and Sub-Zero specific chapters, with their partners getting their own later on before they decided it would be cooler to have them in pairs here? Anyway, while the cinematography is slightly better in Jackie vs Cabal, the dialogue for Jax about his Revenant era is more interesting, so he has the edge. Plus, him catching Jackie is nice. The Jade fight goes to Jax because Jade discusses her motivations, while she has to stop and think of a lame retort against Jackie.
Not so much. Spare me your pity, Earthrealmer.
Plus, Jackie's zombie fight has a wee bit more going on. The cinematography and conversation award go to Jax vs Noob. There's no long silent pause, and the discussion of Ermac has more than the generic dialogue Jackie has. Plus, Jax not being able to break out of the Shadow's grasp despite his freakish strength is silly. And Jackie gets the Cetrion fight since both are about equal in cinematography, but the
"Eat your heart out, Cassie Cage"
line honestly won me over. While Twindell beating Geras' arse and sending him over to where Shao is so he can pulverize him certainly works, I think Shao testing his body out after being healed makes more sense in terms of storytelling. Plus, he's got a personal beef with Kronika, unlike Twindell. Plus, Twindell screams him away after the branches reconvene anyway. Cassie is tough, but I gave it to Shao because Twindell lacks a callback to MKX despite them fighting there, and we don't see how Johnny lands in Shao's version, which makes the cut to him slumped against a rock less jarring. And for Johnny, Shao calls back to MK9, Twindell has an actual reaction to the outcome, and there's no mention of breeding slaves. Easy choice. Kung Lao finally getting the shot at Shao Kahn he was denied in MK9, but still failing adds to the tragedy of his character. Shao calls back to MK9, and he actually speaks as he tosses him overboard. Much more than Twindell just calling him a virgin. Now comes the part where we look over the data to reach some fun conclusions. As with Injustice 1, I'll provide these titles to both the persona, both, and the character, solo. The persona with the most fights is Jade with 15. The character with the most fights is Shang Tsung, also with 15. Impressive for someone absent for 2/3 of the entire experience. The personas with the least fights are Sector, Cyrax, and Scarlet with 2 each. The character with the least fights is Present Raiden with 0. Present Sonya, Present Eren, and Present Cabal come second with 1 apiece. The most overdone persona and character matchup is Shao Kahn vs Kotal Kahn, which plays out 4 separate times, one of which is playable. But the only matchup playable more than once is Raiden vs Liu Kang, which we do as Raiden both times. So in theory, that should be the winner. However, the sheer absurdity of the Shao vs Kotal situation just takes that over the edge. The persona and character with the most wins is Shang Tsung with 12. The personas with the least wins are Baraka, Cetrion, Cyrax, Eren Black, Frost, Cabal, Collector, Kronika, Noob Saibot, Sector, and Scarlet with 0 between them. The characters with the least wins, excluding the aforementioned, are Present Jax, Past Johnny, Past Kano, Present Kitana, Present Kung Lao, Present Raiden, and Present Sonya with 0 each. The persona with the most losses is Jade with 10. The character with the most losses is Present Jade with 7. The personas with the least losses are Cassie Cage, Sonya Blade, and Shiva with 1 each. The characters with the least losses are Present Johnny, Past Sonya, Past Jax, Present Raiden, and Hanzo with 0 each. Yes, Hanzo dies without ever losing a fight. The strongest persona ratio is Cassie Cage's 4:1. The strongest character ratio is Past Sonya's 5:0. The biggest positive ratio gap for both persona and character is Shang Tsung's gap of 9. The biggest negative persona gap is Jade's 5. The biggest negative character gap is Present Jade's 6. The most balanced persona ratios are Jackie Briggs's 2:2, her father's 4:4, and Kung Lao's 5:5. The most balanced character ratios are the aforementioned 2:2, and the 1:1 shared by Present Kano and Present Nightwolf. The weakest persona ratio is 0:4, shared by Eren Black and Cabal. The weakest character ratio is likewise 0:4, shared by Present Kitana and Present Jade. The biggest persona and character glow up is Shang Tsung, with 12 more wins and 1 less loss than he had in MK9. Xiao also did well, but not quite as much. And going purely from X to 11, Fujin gained 6 more wins along with 2 losses. But the real runner-up is present Kano, who finally got a win after 2 games of constant losses. The most static awards are cancelled this time because no one came in with the same results. The closest are Kano, who still has 2 more losses than wins, and past Kitana, who has 4 to 2 like her MKX counterpart. The biggest persona downgrade is Jade, who has 1 more win than last time, but as many losses as she previously had fights. The biggest character downgrade came down to present Sonya, Kitana and Jade. Sonya has 7 less wins, but also 2 less losses. Kitana doubled her losses and has 0 wins compared to her 4 as non-playable last time. And Jade has a quarter of the wins and over double the losses. While Sonya came down to a 0% win rate, the other 2 at least doubled their losses and at least quartered their wins. Despite how many losses she has, Jade did at least win a fight, so I'm giving it to Kitana. So, our final conclusion is that Shang Tsung is the winner of Mortal Kombat 11, with 2 wins above second place and the largest gap between his wins and losses, both of which he'd still achieve if we removed the timeline splitting final fight, and he got a substantial glow up over his MK9 appearance, all while being entirely relegated to the final third of the story, and with a masterful performance by Kari Hiroyuki Tagawa that revitalised the character and made him a must-have going forward. Our loser then is Revenant Jade. Not only do the Jades have the most losses, double their combined wins, the largest negative gap and the largest downgrade for personas, she personally has the most losses and largest gap for characters and was a runner-up for biggest character downgrade. Despite getting a win, she's atrocious. It's like she was making up for lost time after sitting out MKX. And one last thing before we go, always go down to the comments to look for a pinned comment. I usually get something wrong in these videos, so I don't want you walking away with incorrect information if that happens again. Next time, we'll be moving on to the next timeline where things are going to get complicated yet again. Just not quite in the way you might think. If you liked this video, why not subscribe and support me on Patreon like these fine people here? If not, then make sure to share it with your enemies so they can suffer along with you. Today's recommended video is Why I Hate Mortal Kombat 11... by True Underdog Gaming. There's not enough hate for MK11. Keep up the good work, mate.